The butterfly effect and the goddess of fortune. Today I want to invite you to walk down a different path, a path where the smallest things become immense. A tiny gesture, a mistake, a detail almost invisible, can twist the course of history. Think for a moment about your own life. Haven't you ever missed a train, turned down a street, answered a call, and later realized that your whole day changed because of that single tiny decision? That delay, that crossing, that call, they were butterflies flapping their wings. That is the butterfly effect. The idea that a single flap in one place can trigger a storm in another. Not always right away, not always in a visible way, but always with the certainty that the small can carry enormous consequences. History is full of these turns. Tiny instants that, without meaning to, diverted the course of kingdoms, wars, or discoveries. Sometimes it's luck. Sometimes it's fortune. Luck can be good or it can be cruel, a twist of chance that saves or condemns. Fortune, on the other hand, is always good. To be fortunate means to be rescued by chance. And today, I want to show you how those invisible threads are woven through our shared history. How a gesture, a cloud, a single word end up weighing more than armies, governments, or carefully laid plans. 5 stories. 5 moments when destiny tipped because of a detail. 5 butterflies flapping their wings. A gesture of mercy for the merciless. The year was 1918. The Western Front was a hell of mud and barbed wire. The air smelled of gunpowder and damp earth. Cannons thundered in the distance, and every so often the silence was torn apart by a whistle and a nearby explosion. In the middle of that nightmare, a British soldier, Henry Tandey, marched with his unit. Exhausted, covered in mud, his eyes fixed on a horizon broken by smoke and ruins. Suddenly, from among the rubble, a German soldier appeared, staggering, wounded, too weak to go on fighting, almost defeated. Tandey raised his rifle. His finger tightened on the trigger. The enemy was completely at his mercy. In a single instant, it could all be decided. And then, he did not shoot. He let that young man walk away alive. A gesture of compassion in the midst of brutality. That man's name was Adolf, a young Austrian who had once tried to make his way in the world as a painter. Twice he had submitted his work to the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna. Twice they rejected him. He has no talent, the jury ruled. 1 rejection. 1 bullet that never left the barrel. 2 tiny details that changed the course of an entire century. Because that wounded soldier would become the most ruthless leader Europe had ever known. The man who would plunge the world into a second war. The man who would leave a scar that history can never erase. And here's where the question comes in. What would you have done in Tandey's place? Would you have fired or lowered the gun? And what if that jury in Vienna had seen in Adolf's paintings the promise of a future artist? What if they had accepted him instead of discarding him as worthless? The fate of the 20th century hung by those 2 invisible threads, a gesture of mercy and an academic rejection. 2 chances that opened the door to a dark future. The cloud that decided the fate of millions, August 1945. The world was only beginning to grasp what had happened in Hiroshima. An entire city reduced to ashes in seconds, tens of thousands dead, and a new fear spreading across the planet. Atomic power. 3 days later, an American bomber took off, carrying a second bomb nicknamed Fat Man. The primary target was not Nagasaki, it was the city of Kokura, a military and weapons production center. The plane reached the area, but the sky was covered. Thick clouds, smoke from previous bombings that darkened the horizon even further. The pilots made their first pass. They couldn't see the target. They tried again. Fuel was running low, tension was rising. The orders were clear. Do not release the bomb unless the target is seen with precision. The commander, Charles Sweeney, made the decision to turn. He aimed at the secondary target, Nagasaki. In Kokura, life went on. The streets, the temples, the families, all spared by a passing cloud. In Nagasaki, instead, the bomb fell at 11 in the morning, and the city became a hell on earth. In Japan, an expression was born, the luck of Kokura. A destiny twisted by the smallest of details, a phrase still used today to describe someone who narrowly escapes tragedy. And here comes the inevitable question, what if the clouds had cleared just a moment earlier? Would people today speak of the luck of Nagasaki? How many lives would have shifted to a different city, a different story? a different memory. The Sandwich and the End of an Empire. June 1914. The city of Sarajevo was draped in flags, but also in tension. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was an old and fractured giant, filled with peoples and nationalities demanding independence. The heir to the throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, travelled there to display the empire's strength, accompanied by his wife, Sophie. That very morning, there had already been an attempt on his life with a grenade. The bomb exploded, but missed its target. The Archduke, stubborn as ever, chose to continue with his tour. He insisted on visiting the soldiers wounded in the attack at the hospital. A noble decision, but also a reckless one. Meanwhile, one of the young conspirators from the Black Hand organization, Gavrilo Princip, felt defeated. The plan seemed to have failed. Exhausted and hungry, he stepped into a small cafe to grab something to eat, perhaps just a simple sandwich before leaving the city. At that exact moment, the Archduke's driver took a wrong turn. While trying to correct the route, the car came to a stop, right in front of the cafe where Princip stood. A frozen instant in time. Princip walked out, raised his pistol, and fired 2 shots. Franz Ferdinand collapsed, mortally wounded. Sophie, at his side, was struck as well. The couple died, embraced in the back seat. That act lit the spark that ignited the First World War. Within days, all of Europe was dragged into a web of military alliances. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Russia mobilized its troops. Germany backed Austria. France and England rushed to defend their allies. The continent plunged into a conflict no one imagined would be so long, or so bloody. Millions of lives were lost. Entire empires crumbled. The map of Europe was redrawn forever, all because of a wrong turn and a sandwich at the wrong time. And here comes the inevitable question: what if the driver had stayed on course? Or if Princip had stepped out a minute later? Would the empire have survived? Could the Great War have been avoided? The careless act that saved millions of lives. 1928. In a modest London laboratory, Scottish researcher Alexander Fleming returned from vacation. On his desk, he found what looked like carelessness, a petri dish left behind covered with bacteria. But in the middle of that messy growth was a clear circle, a spot where the bacteria refused to spread. The cause was nothing more than a simple mold. Fleming observed, he wrote notes, he repeated experiments. That mold, Penicillium notatum, was releasing a substance that killed bacteria, and thus penicillin was born. The discovery was nearly accidental, yet its consequences reshaped humanity. Before penicillin, even a minor infection could be a death sentence. A poorly treated cut, pneumonia, even a complicated childbirth could end a healthy life. Doctors had little to offer: amputate, pray, and hope for the best. Penicillin changed everything. Wounds that once killed began to heal. Diseases like syphilis, gonorrhea, and tuberculosis, illnesses that had devastated millions, finally met an effective enemy. The age of antibiotics had begun, and with it, human life expectancy soared like never before. All thanks to an accident, a dish forgotten in a corner, and the curiosity of a scientist who saw what others would have simply thrown away. And here's the question: what if Fleming had tossed that dish in the trash? How many decades would humanity have waited for the key to fight infection? Would we still fear a common cold, a small wound, a complicated birth? One careless act, one insignificant mold, and millions of lives saved. Immediately, the word that brought down a wall. November 1989. The world was holding its breath. The Cold War had divided the planet for over 40 years into 2 irreconcilable blocs: the capitalist West, led by the United States, and the communist East, under the shadow of the Soviet Union. At the center of that tension, Germany stood as the cruelest metaphor. After World War II, it had been split in 2, the Federal Republic of Germany in the West and the German Democratic Republic in the East. But the most visible wound was in its capital. Berlin, one single city, severed by a wall of concrete, watchtowers and barbed wire. The Berlin Wall was not just a physical barrier, it was a symbol of a world divided. of families torn apart, of friends who could no longer cross to the other side. For years, the wall stood unbreakable. Some risked their lives trying to cross it. A few succeeded. Many died in the attempt. It was a daily reminder that freedom could be cut off by blocks of stone. That November, protests in East Germany grew louder by the day. Thousands demanded freedom of movement, the lifting of restrictions. The regime was weakened, with no clear answers. And then, in the middle of that tension, came the unexpected. At a press conference, spokesman Günther Schabowski read from a pile of confused notes. A journalist asked him when the new travel rules would take effect. Schabowski hesitated, shuffled his papers, and answered, almost offhand, immediately. That phrase was not in the plan. No clear orders had been given. But within minutes, the news raced across radio and television. That very night, thousands of Berliners poured into the streets. The guards, bewildered, didn't know what to do. Crowds pressed against the checkpoints, demanding to cross. With no instructions to follow, the soldiers relented. The gates swung open and the wall came down. The slip of a spokesman had sped up the inevitable. Divided Germany began to reunite, and with the fall of the wall, the Soviet bloc itself began to crumble. The Cold War was entering its epilogue, and here's the final question. What if Schabowski had said tomorrow or soon? Would the end of an era have been delayed weeks, months? Would Europe's destiny have shifted over a single word? One wrong adverb, one careless phrase, and a wall that tumbled down. Between butterflies and chance. Looking back, connecting the dots always seems simple. We can draw the line from a tiny gesture to a colossal change. But in the moment, no one knows. No one imagines that a bullet never fired, a passing cloud, or a slip of the tongue could shake the course of everything. And yet, that is how we live. Every day, you and I make tiny choices that seem insignificant. Which path to take, which silence to keep, whose hand to reach for. Details we may not even remember. Yet tomorrow, they could be the start of something far greater. Because history is not only what kings, generals, or politicians did, it is also made of everyday gestures, of chance, of mistakes, of impossible coincidences, of butterflies flapping their wings without knowing what storm they're stirring. And this is where fortune comes in, that good luck that sometimes saves us, that places us in the right spot, just when life opens a door we thought was shut. The butterfly effect is not locked away in history books. It's in our lives, in your life, in mine, in every small step we take, unaware of where it may lead. So next time you wonder if a gesture matters, think of Henry Tandey lowering his gun, of a cloud over Kokura, of a driver taking the wrong street, of a dish forgotten in a lab, of a spokesman who said immediately, 5 chances, 5 butterflies flapping their wings, and the world was never the same again. And now the question is for you. What was your butterfly? That tiny detail that changed everything. And which one do you hope will flap its wings to transform your tomorrow? What did you think of today's story? Leave it in the comments. I love to read your opinion. And if you want to keep joining me on this journey of stories and coincidences, subscribe and hit the bell. There are many what-ifs waiting to be told.